Now, this is purported to be a self-portrait of Canaletto, but we don't really know. And that's often the case with these portraits that I show you. Just a second, full screen mode. Okay.
Oh yeah, nice job.
Ah, well, I got that much right.
Yeah.
So
Now we're cooking with.
okay, so Antonio Canaletto, first of all, his father's name was, the family name was Canal. Canaletto means little canal, the little canal, the little boy. His father, the family was quite prosperous in Venice. They even had a coat of arms. So he was privileged. His father he did the scenes for the opera in Venice. And when Antonio was young, he worked with his father. That's how he first used the paintbrush, doing massive scenes for the opera for, among other people, Vivaldi. So he would have got to know Vivaldi quite well, actually. And it's interesting because they're similar. Both men were obsessive workers who did nothing but create art. And had very little of a private life that we know of. He's kind of, Canaletto's a cipher that way. In any case, in 1718, which is a significant date in Venice because they lost they had a war, 350-year war with the Turks, with the Ottomans. And the last battles of that war happened in 1718, and Venice was defeated. And Venice Venice at one time controlled the whole Eastern Mediterranean. It was an incredible power with something like 1,200 war galleys. It lost in 1718, so it was the beginning of its final decline, which had started once the New World and the passage to India was discovered. So in 1718, his father takes him and his brothers to Rome because he's given the job of doing the stage sets I did not write down the musician, but it was anyway, it was for operas in Rome, and I'll remember in a second. He was not very happy working with actors. It's one of the few things we know about him is he didn't like actors. And once he got to Rome, he met a Roman painter who was out painting outdoors, which was a very unusual thing to be doing in those days, Giovanni Panini, who was the same age as Antonio Canal, well, a few years different. And they became friends, and Giovanni Panini introduced him to painting outdoors. This is one of Panini's later, probably studio pieces, but it shows you the kind of work he did. Oh, by the way, it was Scarlatti that they were doing the stage sets for in Rome. Anyway, Canaletto declared his interest in becoming a painter and worked with Panini, and both Panini had been influenced by another painter who'd arrived in Rome about 30 years before, who, it's very interesting because we have the north-south thing happening here. You remember from early on, the Italian artists were quite influenced on occasion by northern painters. Caspar van Widdel was from Holland, and from a town, Amersfoort, very near Amsterdam. And he eventually left Holland for Rome, and probably the wars in Holland were part of the reason he left. The French invaded Holland, and it was a terrible mess. He actually comes to Rome not long after uh, the the death in I'm just spacing out names right now. The death of Vermeer in Holland. He comes to Rome, and he starts painting cityscapes in Rome. And he was actually the very first person to paint on site in Rome, or in most of the world, actually. It was a very new practice, though I suspect this painting was only done partially on site. It's a painting that interests me because I've painted right around here. This bridge to the Isola Tiberina in the middle of the Tiber is the only remaining Roman bridge in Rome. So it's almost 2,000 years old. It was built just after the birth of Christ.
But none of the structure is there except the bridge?
That bridge is there. Oh, some of these other buildings are here. Oh yeah, and the church back. A lot of the other structures are here, but it's the only surviving bridge from Roman times.
Got it. Wow.
So anyway, he inspired Panini and Canaletto when they were in Rome. And then, and this is something Canaletto did, he was in Rome. What's interesting about this is it's not a painting of a place. It's what's called why am I getting stage fright today? It's because I'm trying to do this perfectly and I'm not managing. It's called a capriccio. And capriccios go back to Roman times. The Romans, who made architecture the main form of actually establishing and maintaining their way of life in the empire, were totally obsessed with architecture, and many of their wall paintings had these fantastic architectural forms in them, and that remained a tradition. So Canaletto, apart from doing very literal or fairly literal renderings of Venice and elsewhere, also did capriccios, and this is one of them. He's taken different buildings from different places in Rome, put them together, and it's believed that he's put himself in down here on the lower right, with his back to us. Kind of like Vermeer, who only showed us himself with his back to us. Now, back in Venice, there was an artist who was already painting Venice at the time that he returned, and had been for some years. And Luca Calavarigi's, there is this extra I as a mistake on my part. This Luca was also influenced by Caspar van Wittel, or Van Vitelli, as the Italians called him, and set up in Venice, and took, he actually took Canaletto under his wing and coached him. And Canaletto, and probably introduced him to the camera oscura. This was the camera oscura actually owned by Canaletto. Now, the light comes in here, and there's also a lens to focus it, and there's an image that shows on ground glass up here. You put a semi-transparent piece of paper in here and you can trace on it. However, you have to, if you're outside, you have to be in a tent to use this because you can't see the image clearly enough. Or you can use it if you're in a building and you pull the curtains around the camera oscura, so the room is dark. And in fact, many of Canaletto's paintings are done from second-story windows. When you look at them, you realize that that's where the drawings have been executed. I don't think he ever did paintings. You wouldn't be able to use this to do paintings, but you could do sketches like this. And these ones we know were done using a camera oscura. And he's collecting information for a composition. He's getting all the proportions right. But we also know that many of his drawings were done without the camera oscura. It was just a tool he used some of the time. Now, if you remember the painting we saw earlier. Maybe I'll go back to it really quickly. By Luca Galavargis. This is of what's called the Riva of the Riva dei Schiavoni, which means actually the waterfront of the Slavs, and it's right in front of the Ducal Palace. But Luca's painting started here, and Canaletto's painting starts further back. He backs up some, but it's the same location essentially. This wharf was called the waterfront of the Slavs because this is where they brought their goods from the Eastern Adriatic. Venice was totally dependent for much of its resources on the Eastern Adriatic, which it controlled, and from which it got much of its stone, its lumber, and also slaves. Schiavo in Italian means slave. And it was, so the Slavs were the first slaves in Italy. And here we see Santa Maria della Salute, which is at the entrance to the Grand Canal, and La Dogana, the customs house, where ships had to stop to declare their goods. Now, this is almost the same view, reorganized and obviously a studio piece. And it's a huge ceremonial occasion where the French ambassador is coming and he's being greeted by the Doge. Remember, Venice is now in decline, but they didn't give up on ceremony. They had 1,000 years to develop these incredibly lavish ceremonies, and they weren't about to stop. This is actually, we've now gone further down the shoreline away from the Ducal Palace, which is here. This is I think, quite a lovely painting, and is a good example of his mature work. The way he uses the sky, and this clearly very loose brushwork or even knife work in the sky. So we're looking at a few of his mature works here. And this, one of the things you discover when you look at his works is, though this would have been fairly early in his career, one of the things you discover is he uses the same sites over and over again. And he's using the preliminary sketches to repaint and create different effects. So here we have this one, and then we have this one. Can you see that it's the same place from a slightly different viewpoint? The building on the left is the giveaway. And we're looking down the Grand Canal towards San Marco. To me, this, which is the earlier of the two, is actually the superior painting in my mind. What happened is so when he came back to Florence and started painting, the English took an interest in him. They found him painting on the shoreline and initially doing smaller paintings. And an Englishman by the name of Owen Swinney encouraged him to do small paintings and found him other English people who would buy them. So he's kind of set him up in business. And we have an account of his business methods during those days from a woman who was trying to buy something from him. She said, "The fellow is whimsical and varies his prices every day. And he that has a mind to have any of his work must not seem too fond of it, for he'll be the worse for it, both in price and the painting too." So he was, right from the beginning, Canaletto was a canny businessman and took control. Later in Venice, this gentleman with connections to everyone in England, Joseph Consul Smith, took him under his wing and encouraged him to do much larger paintings. And this would be an example of that period. Now, here's another view that he does many times. This is one of the earlier ones. And what's interesting to me is he's painting Piazza San Marco when they're replacing the paving in the middle. It's actually unfinished here. He was interested in process. He painted everything. He didn't have, things did not have to be perfect for him. He was actually interested in process in the city. But it's interesting to compare this one with the next one, which was painted later, and feels much more like a studio piece. And obviously aimed at the aristocratic market, but a beautiful painting nonetheless. So here's a very interesting drawing because he's painting the bell tower when it is being repaired. It obviously had some very serious damage here. And he does this throughout his life. He draws and paints everything. And you can see he's a magnificent draftsman. He also later, when the British were coming less to Venice because of wars in Europe, Smith encouraged him to do a whole bunch of engravings, which they made into a book, and Smith tried to sell them in England, but it wasn't a great success, which is surprising. Look, this is an utterly beautiful engraving, which could be a capriccio. I don't know. It may not be a real place. So again, this is one of the earlier ones and very interesting to compare with a later painting of the same view. Notice the woman in the balcony here and the way the ships are arranged. We go on to the next painting. The next painting, which is very different, he arranges the ships in the same way in the foreground, but everything, all the other figures are different. But look, he has the same woman in the balcony. And he's added a chimney sweep up here. So one of the things about him, when you begin to look at him closely, is his handling of figures is actually incredible. And he's telling us stories here that might well have been familiar to people in his day, but don't really mean very much to us now. But just to go back to the other one for a second, because I consider that a superior painting. But what do you think?
The detail is incredible.
Yeah, in both of them, but
yeah,
this one is much crisper. It's clearly a studio piece.
Yeah.
I think the other one may well have been painted on site.
Yeah.
Again, he's probably working from a window. But the sky in this one is
It looks like it's a different time of day.
Yes, it is a different time of day.
It's like,
absolutely.
this was like almost like twilight or something, or dawn. I mean, you know,
Let's
sort of
see,
like later.
Yeah, it's facing, if I'm correct,
It looks like the sun is going down and the shadow.
Yeah.
They just have they're completely different moods.
They sure do.
Yeah.
This is like bright daylight, optimistic. The other one's kind of moody and
Yeah.
I like the first one.
The other one is more in the manner of Caravaggio and the Baroque school, actually.
Yeah.
Now this is considered by many to be his best painting.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the influence of the Northern painters, you know, because this is more like the kind of thing you might have seen from Holland, but it's a beautiful painting, and he's paid real attention to this is the stonemason's yard. And he's paid real attention to what's going on down here. The woman dealing with the children, the man actually carving stone, this man too, and someone else. I'm not sure what she's doing here, but there's someone inside this shed too. It's wonderful. The thing that I like the most about him is that nothing is outside of his interest. And he will paint sometimes scenes that you would not expect from him. This is also a very melancholy and very powerful painting. Let me see. It's the Grand Canal near Santa Maria della Carità. See, oh yes, okay. So now I'm going to show you a bunch of what are mostly his earlier paintings, many of which would have been done on site, though you can't always tell. And we can't always trust him on this issue either. He said what was necessary to please his clients. But I think this is a magnificent painting. This is looking, from Venice, it's looking northwest. And in the foreground this is an island, San Michele, where they bury their dead. It's entirely a massive graveyard with a church. Lord Byron, for instance, is buried here because Lord Byron hung out later in Venice a lot. He was, I think, mostly interested in the Venetian prostitutes, but and then in the distance is Murano, the island that produced all the glass. And the artisans of Murano were not allowed to leave on pain of death because of the secrets they possessed. But wonderful treatment of the figures in the foreground here too.
Yeah, the light.
This one is actually in Murano. It's San Giovanni dei Battuti, a church. But again, the handling of the figures is just marvelous here. Especially this child with the old man here. And then the two people on the boat whose heads just appear above the wharf here. And atmospheric, I think the painting needs cleaning, but it's got a wonderfully atmospheric quality. I'm absolutely in love with this one. This is the Dogana. This is the front edge of the customs house. And the way this sail is set into the composition with its colors, just magnificent. It's so beautifully understated and effective. And see how he repeats the reds of this in the sail in the clothing of these two people here, tying it together so beautifully. But as I said earlier, he was willing to take on anything. This is a detail of a larger painting called Il Rio dei Mendicenti, which is, it means beggars. So this is the impoverished district of Venice. And but he's done it with the same attention to detail. Look at the woman shaking him up in the window here, and with really giving us a sense of the poverty of this place. And the composition here with this roof coming down, the shaft of light, and these men launching the boat, all of these on the diagonal is very effective. But he could also paint the fashionable. This is, again, a detail from a much larger painting, but the handling of the figures, again, is really quite nice. And not my favorite painting, but almost photorealist when you look at it, so crisp. But important in terms of Venice, this is the entrance to the Arsenale, where we get the word arsenal from. This canal goes back from the entrance is where they mass produced their ships, particularly the warships. During the height of their wars with the Ottomans, they were producing a warship a day. They had something like 30,000 workers working in the Arsenale. And they would launch a hull, and as it went down the canal, it would be outfitted with everything, so that when it left, it would be ready to go to sea. Here they're obviously working on probably just repairing a large ship that is, you know, this is an ocean-going vessel rather than a galley, but it's, you can see he recorded absolutely everything in Venice at one time or another. Now this is a lovely one, which I actually was completely taken in by this. I thought, well, this is definitely done from life. It's one of the little islands on the lagoon. It's actually a capriccio. It's a complete invention. The church here is stolen from Padova and other buildings from elsewhere. The whole thing is an invention, but utterly impressive, I think. Now this is a more obviously a capriccio. He did many of these and they were very popular. There was a point at which he could sell more capriccios than paintings of Venice itself. So he mass produced them. This one is interesting to me because, you know, he's painting during the Rococo period, which was defined by the French court and artists like Watteau, Fragonard, Boucher. But you don't get the sense of that in most of his paintings. The Rococo was, you know, very ornate, almost frou-frou, a lot of the style. But here, he's actually hinting at, this is another capriccio. And the way he handles the figures here, the way he handles the whole painting, does suggest Rococo. The Rococo colors in the Rococo period were also pastel, which this painting is using. So he wasn't unaware of the period and he wasn't unable to do that if he'd wanted to. This is a painting I prefer much more. Now this is actually a canal, Brenta Canal in Padova. Padova was part of Venice's land empire, and it was where Venice's banks were in Padova. Very powerful, very wealthy place, and well worth visiting. It's in my video of my last trip to Italy, and it's a beautiful city.
Those little tiles or bricks are really intense.
Aren't they? Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Now this, I don't know if it was started on site, but there's a lot of stuff in it that suggests a lot was done in the studio. But okay, the context of this is he took a nephew under his wing, Bellotto, and taught him how to paint his way. And they traveled together to Padova and painted there and sketched there. So this takes us, but many people think he taught Bellotto too well. This is a painting by Bellotto.
Oh.
And it's pretty, you know, you might almost think it's a Canaletto. It doesn't have the same sense of space that he manages to get in his paintings. It's a little more crisp and sharp in a way that gets in the way of embracing the whole space. But it's an incredibly competent painting and shows a lot of his technique. So this would lead to problems later, because what happens is in 1740, the wars of Austrian succession make it impossible for the English to come to Venice. And at first, as I mentioned earlier, he tries selling prints with the help of his friend Smith, but in 1745, he heads for England. He heads for his market. At the invitation, actually, of Smith and other people who would become patrons in England. But he gets there, and after he's been there for a while, rumors start circulating that he's not Canaletto, because Bellotto, who's gone on to Germany and later to Poland and becomes extremely famous there, starts presenting himself as Canaletto. and even signing his paintings, Canaletto. Word gets back to England, and the English say, well, where is the real Canaletto? Canaletto actually publishes a couple of notices in the English papers saying, you know, I'm the real Canaletto, and if you want to see me painting here in London, just come to my studio. I invite you to visit me. But the rumor, you know, once rumors get started, they never really end. So anyway, he's in London. He's in London at an interesting time. It's 1745, and he stays, well, from 46 to 56, he's in London. In 1666, the whole center of London had burned down. And afterwards, Sir Christopher Wren was given the job of rebuilding London. And what we're seeing here is rebuilt London only shortly after it was rebuilt. And there's St. Paul's Cathedral designed by Christopher Wren. My family is distantly related to him, actually. I have an aunt who used to have his snuff box, but she lost it. This is interesting, though, because it's what he's painting here is the wooden supports under the new Westminster Bridge, which is still being constructed. And you can see there's a bucket here going down to pick up supplies. He was commissioned actually by the man who, Etherbridge, who was in charge of the wooden supports for the construction of the bridge, who was a very important engineer. So Canaletto comes from one of the oldest cities in Europe, which is now on decline, which was a great sea power for a while, for 1,000 years, to England, which is a rising sea power, but spanking new. And he has no problem with that. He's quite happy to paint stuff that's modern and new. In fact, here he is painting the side of Westminster Bridge as it goes up. And this is one of those paintings that almost looks photorealist. Not my favorite painting, but impressive nonetheless. And many paintings of Westminster Bridge. This one, I think, is very evocative and captures some of the quality of the English light. Now, this is painted from, you see, let me make sure I have my facts right here. Yes, it's from Richmond House on the Thames. Now, at the time, Richmond House was about 8 years old. And he was commissioned by the architect, Charles Lennox, the second Duke of Richmond, to paint this. He designed it and he wanted it painted. But it's very interesting how different this is from his paintings of Venice, but how effectively it captures the English light and the English way of life too. It's got more, all his English paintings have a certain stiffness about them compared to his Venetian paintings, which some people complained about, but I think they're appropriate. This is also from Richmond House going in the other direction. And I think is a wonderful cityscape and shows what a master he is of painting anything in the city. This is so very British to me. He also painted the countryside, and he was commissioned by this gentleman here who was involved in commissioning the construction of this bridge, which happened to be actually designed by the same guy who did the supports for the building of Westminster Bridge. So this is his patron, what's interesting about this painting, apart from the real evocation of the English countryside, wonderful tree here, wonderful clouds, is that they think this is a self-portrait here. He's sketching on site.
Mhm.
So in 1756, he returns to Venice, and he's now world famous. So the Venetians the Venetian elite had ignored him for most of his career because he wasn't painting stuff out of his head, very romantic, you know, colorful stuff with lots of large figures, which is what they liked. He was painting the city. To them, it was like boring. They didn't think it took any imagination, and they didn't have any respect for him. But he came back to Venice. He was now world famous. So not that long after he comes back, he's accepted into the Venetian Academy. But his work is now different. It's more sober. And a lot of it has a slightly claustrophobic effect to it, like this one. Though it's still very good painting. Now that the year he's accepted into the Academy, he paints this. And this is the Great Council that had ruled Venice for 1,000 years. This Great Council elected 10 men for a smaller central council who voted in the Doge for life. But the Doge, if he misbehaved too much, would be poisoned or dismissed. But generally, they were in place for life. So this is to me, the main thing about this painting is the patience to do something which, apart from its impressive impact, looks rather boring. I don't know how he painted it. These are all wigs. They're all wearing wigs here. But this, at this point, is 30 years before the end of the Republic, before Napoleon will march in and put an end, and the Doge will abdicate. So he's memorializing something at the very end of its existence. So this is also after his return. And, you know, some people don't like his later paintings because they're not as sparkly and exciting as the earlier ones. But I have to say, I think this one is impressive. This is the last one I'm going to show you. It's an impressive composition, and the use of light and shadow, the way he's composed it is really amazing.
What's the kind of wide angle lens, like kind of?
It is. Well, one of the things is important to realize about him is these are not photographic renderings. He would take buildings out, put buildings in, even in these kind of paintings, and he would expand the space very often.
Right.
Because he understood perspective so well. He's quite able to do that.
Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, it's
shadows, the really long shadows that are cast across the walkway.
Totally.
Yeah, and the way this dark down here moves across,
Mhm.
Yeah.
goes to the foot of the tower is I think just really effective.
There are these for hours and find all these different scenes.
Mhm.
You can look at
How big are his paintings? Are they large? Or they?
they vary in size, but the ones he's most the larger, more detailed ones are about 5.5 feet tall.
Oh yeah, I'd say so. I mean, it's a lot of detail.
And he did. You know how many paintings he's purported to have done? 800.
Oh my God.
And this is maybe why we know nothing about his personal life, because it's quite possible he had no personal life.
Yeah.
He just painted and drew.
A lot of work. It's a lot of detail.
I mean, this was something that impresses you after a while about the Italian artists from the before the Renaissance all the way up to this point, is their utter dedication. and in many cases, their lack of any real private life. Maybe they had trysts with men or women, but it wasn't that important to them. You know, they didn't marry, they just worked and worked and worked.
That is depressing.
Yeah, it's impressive. But the convergence of genius with one of the most beautiful cities in the world is stunning, I think.
Yeah.
And then that he could also bring his talent to London at a critical moment in its history, at the rise of its becoming the center of world power, I think is a fascinating story.
And Anthony, it's such a, I mean, I used to love really bright colors, and I don't know what's happening to me. I just more and more love really muted colors. And so would this be like lots of like sienna, raw sienna, or, because it's so muted, at least that's
Yeah.
the way it looks in the picture.
It may be that it needs cleaning too, that it's not quite as muted as
Right.
it looks.
Right.
But it looks to me like it was, you know, it was much more limited in its color. This is a hazy sky, not a blue sky.
Right.
It looks like it was a much more limited palette. Yeah, he would be using mostly the earth colors that,
Yeah.
you know, he doesn't seem to have gone far beyond them actually anywhere in this
Yeah.
painting, unless it has a cleaning would change that. It certainly works this way, and
Mhm.
one gets the feeling when he got back to Venice, and he obviously wanted to have that, you know, he's a Venetian. He's coming home in his early 60s. By the fact, I mean, you know, we know almost nothing about him, but we do know that at 66, he said, he wrote on one of his paintings, 66 and still not wearing glasses. Which I could have said at 66, but not anymore. But it is a more conservative quality to his painting, which I think he wanted to, you know, he was interested in becoming established and his name being remembered in Venice. And so he was doing paintings that would ensure his entrance into the Academy and that would justify his entrance into the Academy. I mean, the fact that he did that incredibly laborious painting of, you know, the Doge and the Grand Council is a sign that he was aiming at a reputation in the city in terms that the city would understand. But it's interesting that he continues painting up until his death, but at his death it's discovered that he was at that point quite poor. Whatever happened to his money, we don't know. He died almost in poverty, like
No
like
life,
a lot
no
of us.
money. That is so freaking sad. Oh.
Well, he may not have minded. He may have been able to manage. I don't know, but it's a common story. He was lucky that he was accepted into the establishment at the end. Many artists went out of fashion, like Rembrandt.
Is his work in Venice, or where is his work shown or held?
Almost all his work is in England.
In England, okay.
Because he was supported for most of his career by the British, tourists in those days were mostly aristocrats, people with money.
Right.
And they bought his work. They bought it in enormous quantities. I mean, and one thing I could not find, I get so little is known about him, and there are so many conflicting reports. Some writers say he had a studio and he had assistants churning out his paintings, which with some of the paintings make sense to me when I look at them. And others say no, he had no studio. There's no evidence that he had assistants or had a big studio. We just don't know. I think he probably did. That was a common practice. For a period, at least, he had, when the British were buying his works in volume, he was laying them out, he was doing the drawing, he was having other people paint them according to, he may have even had Bellotto doing that for a while for him. his nephew.
If he was that successful selling a lot and died in poverty, there must have been some stuff that he was, he must have had a life.
Yeah, well, it's quite possible that he had a secret private life. That was quite common in those days.
And
Yes.
he spent money, presumably.
Or
Yeah.
lost it, or someone took it, like a raw deal or a deal.
Yeah,
Ugh.
it's or yeah, yeah, he was spending it on something, wasn't he? I mean, the materials and the facilities to paint these works must have been expensive. But yeah. No, I wish I knew more. I'm actually going to look into it some more because I love him so much. His work, him, I don't know if I would have loved. I would have admired him, but
You never heard? I never heard of him, and this is
Really?
one. Never, yeah.
Yeah, never.
Well, for a long, he was not. He's only really come into his own in the 20th century because there was a very strong prejudice for two reasons. One is, he was working presumably from life, which was not considered that original, that creative. But the other thing is, so many of his paintings were purchased just by tourists who didn't necessarily have any taste, except they liked his work. So that the critics saw him as somehow not in the same realm as the more important artists. It's only in the last 100 years that he's been accepted, and I think partly because of the acceptance of things like photorealism.
Yeah.
Though he isn't really a photorealist, it's a mistake to categorize him as such. There's a lot more going on in his paintings, and an incredible facility. I mean, all these figures, just all these figures. It reminds me of some of the paintings we were looking at much earlier of Bruegel, where he just crowded his paintings with figures. How did someone even paint all those figures? And every one of them has to have been sketched or imagined with a considerable amount of attention.
Yeah, they all have their own light and shadow and everything. They
Yeah.
position in the right amount of time of day, that particular area, the shadow. It's like thought out really well. I just like it reminds me of a slice of life photograph of a city. Just you feel like something is, you have a window into that moment.
I mean, he's one of those painters, and there is quite a few like that, that you could spend forever looking at a single painting.
Yeah, I'd love to see this in person.
Well, in England, they have huge amounts of his work.
One day.
Yeah. So that's pretty much, and Cassandra, I imagine you've been recording this because I forgot again. Thank you. We might want to end the recording at this point.